So good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Professor Tim Dunn. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor at the University of Queensland. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this event. Our Vice Chancellor, Professor Peter Hoy, our Vice Chancellor and President, was unable to be here, but he wanted me to convey his best wishes to you all, and of course to share with me in welcoming Professor Andreas Loschel to UQ. So I won't repeat the generous acknowledgements that Peter's already given, but I would, of course, like to extend an extremely warm welcome to our distinguished guest, and also acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, and pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants. So there is no doubt that the challenges presented by climate change are upon us, and the world is responding in different ways. In September last year, we saw Greta Thunberg, a 15-year-old Swedish schoolgirl, begin a series of strikes, refusing to attend school to draw attention to the crisis. This act alone incited a response from school-age students across the world who staged their own protests in response to the lack of global action on climate change. Another movement, the Extinction Rebellion, or XR for short, has emerged, and they are bringing major cities to a standstill through their protests and staged die-ins to bring attention to the catastrophic impact of rising carbon dioxide emissions. Then just last week, we witnessed the tensions arising between the leaders of the Pacific Islands Forum in Tuvalu. Many of the island leaders challenged Australia's Prime Minister on his support for coal for not setting more ambitious targets for carbon reduction. The Prime Minister of Tuvalu put Australia's energy and development dilemma in very stark terms. In his words, "No matter how much money you put on the table, it doesn't give you an excuse not to do the right thing, which is to cut down on your emissions, including not opening your coal mines." So energy policy is a wicked problem for Australia. By this term, I not only mean it is nearly impossible to solve, and more significantly, with all wicked problems, every solution generates further difficulties and often unintended consequences. Doing the right thing by climate change means doing the wrong thing for communities who are dependent on mining. In 2017-18, coal replaced iron ore as Australia's most valuable export, reaching a value of $67 billion. I hope you will forgive me for adding that the prize for the largest and cleanest export earnings, wait for it, is international education. Hooray for us. Returning to the wicked problem, over 35,000 people are employed in the industry, either directly or indirectly, not to mention the billions of dollars received in royalties. In parallel with the extractive approach to energy, renewables, of course, are on the march. The number of Australian household solar power installations has exceeded 2 million. With a tourist board slogan that talks about Queensland's weather as beautiful one day, perfect the next, it is hardly surprising that this state is leading the pack with about 30% of households fitted with solar panels, and the number of utility-scale renewable energy projects is growing exponentially. I was in PNG a few weeks ago on an executive mission led by the Vice-Chancellor, and it was incredible to see how cheap solar panels next to prefab and fairly dilapidated houses and buildings was improving the lifestyle of the local people, enabling them to cook, watch TV, and of course, for children that want to improve themselves and families that want to improve themselves, being able to read late into the night, like most of us did to get to where we are today. Returning to Australia's policy choices, no transition is without its challenges, particularly when it comes to ensuring that those Australians directly affected by the phase-out of coal are assisted in making that transition, finding new opportunities for employment and ensuring that regional communities survive and thrive becomes critical. Recognising these challenges, the University of Queensland has large and diverse research projects and investments in energy. Our Gatton campus hosts the largest PV research facility in the Southern Hemisphere. I don't know where the ones are in the north, but we only seem to care about the south when we make those claims, don't we? We have also, it's really strange, that the Northern Hemisphere, of course I grew up there, the Northern Hemisphere is just as able to make ridiculous claims about itself as the South, but they never put it in hemispherical terms. I don't know what it is about the South, but we love to talk about being number one in a certain hemisphere. It's a shame there are only 2 hemispheres really, aren't there? Otherwise it would be a really good claim. Number one in 1,500 hemispheres, or 10,000 when it comes to universities, where we like to be, where we like our top 50 claim, which is of course a fantastic claim to be benchmarked to. So we have invested in our Gatton campus, we have invested in a 64 megawatt farm at Warwick to offset carbon emissions from our operations. And a new 1 megawatt Tesla battery will be installed on our St. Lucia campus any day now. Then there's the recently completed UQ Surat Deep Aquifer Appraisal Project. This 3-year, $5.5 million project was jointly funded by UQ, the Australian Government's Carbon Capture and Storage Research, Development and Demonstration Programme, and Coal 21. The idea was to show policy and decision makers the feasibility of carbon abatement, and it's done through industrial scale carbon capture and storage in southern Queensland. UQ is working hard to be part of the transition to a low carbon future, and we're collaborating with international partners to do this. Being able to learn from other countries is a great opportunity to share technology and ideas. Germany, with its policies surrounding the energy Wende, is one country that we have much to learn from. Germany is one of the largest generators of solar and wind power. But in response to the Fukushima disaster, the German government committed to phasing out nuclear power by 2022. I'm sure there are other reasons alongside that, but apparently that was a significant factor. And if the Vice-Chancellor was here, he'd probably make his case for civilian nuclear power being the one resolution to the energy dilemma, but I'd rather he made those arguments than me. More recently, the Coal Exit Commission has been working out to phase all coal-fired power stations in Germany by 2038. While these statistics are easy to articulate, no doubt they also present their own wicked problems for Germany. Problems to do with workforce planning, ensuring the security of energy supply lines, and the risk of dependency for oil and gas on large neighbouring countries who may also be unpredictable in their foreign policies. We are fortunate today to have with us Professor Andreas Loschel, Chair for Energy and Resource Economics at the University of Münster, where he is also Director of the Centre of Applied Economic Research. Since 2011, Professor Loschel has chaired the Energy Expert Commission of the German government to monitor energy transformation. And since 2017, he has directed the Virtual Institute Smart Energy, North Rhine-Westphalia. Professor Loschel is lead author of the Global Environmental Outlook of the United Nations Environment Programme, 2014 to 2017, and served as lead author in the Working Group 3 contribution to the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. He is also an advisor to Aurora Energy Research Limited, Oxford, and a ZEW Research Fellow, a fellow member of the CES IFO Network, and a research fellow of the Australian National University. He is a member of the German National Academy of Science and Technology. When I read biographies like that, I think, what have I been doing with my life? But clearly, Andreas has been doing a lot more with his. So please, and seriously, please welcome Andreas to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks for the very kind introduction. Thanks, Tim, thanks, Peter, and thanks to the University of Queensland for inviting me to give this talk today. I'm very happy to see a lot of people showing up for the presentation. Thanks for coming. I can certainly underwrite what you just said on the Queensland weather, and I have to admit I'm at the end of a 2-week holidays here in Queensland. I have to tell you, you're living in a beautiful place indeed. I would like to start the presentation with a German quote. Joe Kaeser, the CEO of the German industrial giant Siemens, said in 2015 when he was asked to comment if anybody would take over responsibility for energy in a country, whether he would have an advice for him. And he said, well, this is easy, just do the opposite of what the Germans are doing. So, I guess in Australia you're doing in many aspects the opposite of what the Germans are doing, so it seems you're doing fine on that quote. On the other hand, today I would like to share with you a bit what the German energy policy actually tries to achieve, why we are doing what we are doing, which sounds pretty crazy. We have just heard phasing out nuclear and coal and being still a major industrial country, and we would as well like to stay a major industrial exporting country. So I'm going to share a bit the idea behind the Energiewende and the story of the phase out of coal, which is now unfolding in German policy making in the next years to come, and try to convince you that even though the Energiewende probably has been implemented quite badly in the past, it still has some merits, in forming this energy transformation. I'm doing that with a background of being the chair of the German government's Energy Monitoring Commission for now 8 years. This is, I think, a relatively inspiring institutional setup. We are doing a yearly account of the energy transition. So there is a monitoring report of the government written yearly, and there is an independent committee that is commenting on this report, and the framing of this is the German energy concept of the year 2010, which is the concept that tries to show how we can achieve a reliable, economically viable and environmentally sound energy supply for the 21st century. And in this energy concept, the German government has given itself a series of targets in different areas, climate change mitigation, energy efficiency, increase of renewable energy in the different sectors of the economy. And we are following up these targets, try to identify what worked in terms of policies and what did not work and what are the main challenges ahead. So if you are interested in this process, and I'm sure we are going to share slides afterwards, now you can find here the different reports. The summaries are in English and in Chinese, I think, so you can have a look. As I said, this is something that is done by the government and with support of this commission. So when we looked at the energy transition, we like to give a very simple picture like this one here, which is summarizing the goal attainment in these different areas. We talked a bit about nuclear. This is working out quite well. Germany has had quite a fraction of nuclear in electricity generation. We have already reduced our nuclear capacity substantially. In the last 10 gigawatt of nuclear is going to leave the system in the next 3 to 4 years. That is not here on the table. The other thing we try to achieve is climate change mitigation, and that is obviously an overarching target of the Energiewende. And if you look at this target, you can see that this is actually in red, meaning that we are not achieving our targets. So we are falling behind the 2020 targets in greenhouse gas emissions in Germany. And we are as well having quite some problems in achieving our 2030 targets. And that's the background of the talk that I'm doing, because the German government identified coal electricity generation as one of the big, of course, drivers of emissions in Germany, and one that is probably easier to tackle than emissions in industry, in transport, and so forth. So we have not really made good progress on CO2 emission reductions despite, you can see here, this is renewable energy, despite that we are doing actually quite fine on the renewable side. No? So if you look on the German energy markets, you can see that electricity generation from renewables has actually constituted around 45% of electricity in the first half of this year. Last year it was 40%, so these numbers have been increased substantially. Okay, over the last years, of course driven by a very expensive support system that we had in place in the last 2 decades. Nevertheless, this is really successful, but it was not enough to drive out fossil-based electricity generation in the German market. So what happened is that we were building up a dual electricity system where we had, the conventional fossil fuel power generations in place, and in parallel built up a renewable generation capacity of more than 100 gigawatt. So we have now more renewable generation installed than conventionals, but the conventional generation is still there. And actually, it's very active. Germany became one of the biggest exporter of electricity in recent years, because you can imagine now these subsidized renewables entering the market have actually led to a situation where there's a lot of electricity on the markets, dropping prices of electricity, and Germany exporting cheap electricity to the European internal market. Germany is in the middle of the European internal market with all our friends on the borders. Very happy to take the cheap electricity from Germany. But of course, in terms of CO2 emissions, these generation, of course, counted as well as Germany's CO2 emissions, and that contributed partly to us not achieving these targets. We are as well not doing very well in other areas, for example, energy efficiency. The original energy concept put a lot of faith on improving energy productivity and increasing energy efficiency. And honestly, we were not very successful. It's really difficult to achieve these large-scale reductions in CO2 emissions and improvements in efficiency. We've seen that energy efficiency policy in Germany is constituted out of a myriad of different programs, with very little impacts in the end. So it turns out it's much more difficult to get these gains from energy efficiency than we thought. Part of it, of course, is that the prices of energy in Germany, they were relatively speaking falling in the last years, which of course makes it really difficult to make the case for energy efficiency. And therefore, a parallel discussion to the one I'm touching now, the coal phase-out, is carbon pricing in Germany. So German government is committed to introduce carbon pricing. We already have, of course, 50% of our emission covered by the EU emissions trading system. That's the electricity sector, that's industry. But we are now as well going to extend this to the other sectors, transport and housing, and there's a big discussion about this in Germany now. Actually, last week we had an article, a commentary in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the biggest German newspaper, together with Frank Jotzo from the ANU, bringing back an old Australian approach, which was very controversial here, but we tried to pitch it in Germany, which is a fixed price emissions trading system, trying to combine carbon pricing with a prospect of energy of the emissions trading system in Germany. So this is a parallel discussion, and of course it's one that would as well help energy efficiency measures in these sectors if we would see proper carbon pricing, which at the moment we don't have, and would allow us to take away a lot of these other, I would say, more inefficient policies that we are facing. Then I told you, of course, this should not only reduce carbon. No, I mean it should be economically viable and environmentally sound and reliable. So therefore we are as well taking track on security of supply issues. on affordability issues, and on public acceptance. And there you see that we put some amber lights here because we think there are some problems with public acceptance. For example, we see that it's getting more and more difficult to bring new renewable projects online in Germany. Actually, wind build-out has stopped practically in 2019. It's really difficult to extend further these renewable shares. So there is an issue of public acceptance, obviously. There is some issue with affordability. We pay a lot for electricity in Germany. People and industry can still afford it. Why? Because they are quite strong in terms of value-added generation, and they are competitive on the international markets. They are as well quite good in terms of efficiency, so prices don't really roll one-to-one on costs, and as well, as I said, they can cope with it, and the German households as well are doing quite well, so they are still able to afford these high spendings on electricity. But of course, the question is how long this is going to sustain. And the other point is security of supply, which at the moment, again, is not so problematic, because I told you the story of the two electricity generation systems, no? So we still have fully our conventional system in place. So if we have times where renewables are not contributing to electricity generation, that is not really a problem, because our peak demand of 80 gigawatt we can still afford or supply fully with conventional power plants. No? And we had, even this year, we had times, days, weeks where renewables are not contributing, and then of course the conventional power plants were running. So this is not a problem for now, but if we are now moving out of coal, we really have to think how we deal with this issue. And my argument will be that for the next years to come, we are not going to face substantial security of supply problems, because we are living in this overcapacity situation in Germany. And that's not only Germany, but it's actually Europe. With a lot of overcapacity. But as Germany is moving out of coal, of nuclear, and other countries are doing the same. We talked a bit about nuclear power plants in France, for example. No? So if they are also reducing capacities, we are going to see more and more problems in the end of the 2020s, and we really have to think about how to cope with security of supply issues, supply adequacy issues by then, and that's something we have to keep in mind. So this is a bit the background on the German energy transition. And I told you we are setting up all these nice plans. One of them is the Climate Action Plan 2050, which sets 2030 targets. And I just want to show you that these targets, they are distributing emission reductions between different sectors. And you can see that the share of the reductions in the energy sector is actually the highest. They want to reduce in energy 60% of CO2 emissions relative to 1990. The same for buildings, because they still believe that's easy and cheap. It's probably not. And then lower numbers for industry, transport, agriculture, as the emission reductions are much more difficult to achieve in these sectors. So if you want to achieve the 60 plus% reduction in the energy sector, of course you have to think about how to deal with coal. Because coal is indeed a large share of the German electricity generation. It constitutes, as you will see, around 40% of generation at the moment. So obviously that's a big contributor to emissions, but it's as well a big producer of electricity. Now, moving then to the coal phase-out, I would like to mention that this is what I'm talking about today is not the first coal phase-out. Actually, it's the second one, because we had a first coal phase-out, which was the phase-out of hard coal mining. So the whole German Wirtschaftswunder, the post-war economic boom in Germany, was of course fueled by hard coal. and hard coal mines in the state of mainly North Rhine-Westphalia. I'm now at the University of North Rhine-Westphalia. I mentioned that we have a memorandum of understanding between North Rhine-Westphalia and Queensland, in fact. So, of course, this here was our first coal phase out, and you can see that we had hundreds of mines and almost 600,000 miners in coal mining in Germany. And coal mining in Germany lost competitiveness in the 70s and 80s. And so you can see that the numbers of mines and miners, they have been decreasing from 600,000, okay, to 0. By last year. Actually, last year, the last coal mine was closed. And this is instructive because in 2007, the federal government, together with the state government in North Rhine-Westphalia, and the mining companies and the trade unions agreed on this phase out of hard coal mining subsidies in Germany by 2018. No? So they had some time to ensure that these subsidies will be discontinued in a socially acceptable manner and still cover the cost of what they call perpetual mine management. And they managed. No? So last coal mine actually closed last year, and this process took 50 years, more or less. And it's still ongoing. So if you go to the Ruhr Valley, you can see that they are still dealing with this transformation process, but they think they have done a relatively good job, with a lot of new universities being generated, with tourism being a large part of the income of these regions. If you visit the Ruhr Valley now, it's a really tourism spot. Now you can go biking for kilometers. You will see a lot of startup hubs there, new businesses being brought in, and so forth. So that's really interesting. In terms of transformation, coal is no longer mined in Germany. I'm sure you know, or you're happy to know that Australia actually provides 13% of the coal to Germany. So our hard coal is coming mainly from Russia, the United States, and then comes Australia. Okay, but no more coal mining. That's the first phase out. The second phase out I'm talking about here is lignite mining and hard coal power generation. And the hard coal fleet in Germany, even though we are no longer mining, we have a lot of hard coal power plants. And you can see that the hard coal fleet is the largest in Europe. So it has been reduced over the years, but it's still large. And that is, as I said, the background of this commission on growth, structural change and employment that was initiated by the German government in 2018. We call it the Coal Phase-Out Commission. But our vice government called it differently, growth, structural change and employment. Okay, and I think that was just trying to make sure that it's not really about only phasing out coal, but it's really about setting up a roadmap for these transformation or transition processes in the lignite mining regions. And that is very important because I told you 1/3 of electricity generation in Germany still coming from coal, and of course Germany is the largest lignite producer in the world. And that's for a long time, since the beginning of the industrial lignite mining. So we have open cast mines in eastern Germany, in the Lausitz, and Saxony-Anhalt. In these open cast coal mines, they were of course indispensable for the industry of the former German Democratic Republic, so Eastern Germany. And in the western part, we have the Rhenish mining district. okay, in North Rhine-Westphalia, which still is really important now for electricity generation and as well for lignite mining. So, so the idea was really to think about how to set up the structural change and do this in a consensus-oriented dialogue with stakeholders. That's the idea. That's the idea of the first coal phase out. That's as well the idea of this, what we call Rhenish capitalism, okay, where these different stakeholders come together. So in the coal commission, we had representatives of utilities, we had electricity users, we had trade unions, local communities, NGOs, academics, and the state heads, or the government, state governments and the federal governments, to set up these phase-out plan. And I already told you, Tim has already told you that the decision was to phase out, or the recommendation was to phase out coal for electricity by 2038 or probably even earlier. Perhaps 2035. And there are three phases of this, starting with a very rapid reduction in coal power plant capacity of about 1/3 by 2022, another third by 2030, and the last third in the 2030s. So that's the recommendation. I'm going to show you as well what that means. Well, why are we not so much worried about the first part? Well, you can probably not read it here, but you're going to have the possibility to read it on the slides. There will be a substantial economic phase-out of coal in the next decade to come. Why is that the case? Well, I told you about, the penetration of renewables, the falling electricity prices. We have a lot of old power plants in Germany that are relatively inefficient, and these older power plants, they will have really problems in competing in the next years to come. So this is the status quo in Germany in terms of electricity generation. You see Germany is a big exporter, and this is in terms of capacity. So you can see that there is quite some generation coming from lignite and hard coal, and quite some capacity in lignite and hard coal. In total, we have about 40 gigawatt of coal generation capacity. Okay, and here you can see different scenarios, what will happen until 2030, and in all of these scenarios you can see that the share of coal is going to reduce dramatically in business as usual. So a lot of coal plants are going to leave the market. Most of the scenarios, they forecast a shake-up with around half of the coal power plants leaving the market in the next 10 years. So that means you're going to see this market-driven coal out in the next years. And of course that depends then as well on other developments. So what are we doing with the carbon prices? What are we going to see in terms of gas prices, coal prices on the international market? How is the electricity consumption going to develop? So there are a lot of open issues there, obviously, but that's the main message. It's not going to achieve our targets, so the market-driven phase-out of coal is not going to achieve the 60+% greenhouse gas emission reduction, so you would have to do a bit more than that, and therefore the recommendations of the Coal Commission are on top of what we are going to see market-driven in the future, because these recommendations try to achieve the 60+% reduction by 2030. What you as well are going to see is that Germany is going to reduce its electricity exports substantially, and we are going to be more or less a net importer, even though a small one, but obviously there will be times where we are going to import larger shares of electricity from our neighbors, and that is something I would like to talk about later. That's of course an issue that we have to think about, but at the moment, as I said, we are still a big exporter, and we as well see that the electricity prices are going to change substantially due to this market-driven phase-out, okay? And actually the wholesale electricity prices are going to increase by more than 50%. But this is again business as usual because of higher electricity prices, phase-out of all power plants, and the development on the resource markets, okay? The coal phase-out is going to add to this price signal, but we think that the additional costs are relatively moderate to what we are going to see in the market just by these different factors I've just told you about. And it might be even be more complex because you know that we have a new commission, EU Commission, going to start, and they have announced that climate change will be on their agenda, very high on their agenda, and they are as well thinking about renegotiation the European emission reduction target. It's currently 40% by 2030. Ursula von der Leyen, who's going to be the chair, or who's the chair now of the European Commission, she already indicated they are trying to move to 50 or 55%. If this happens, okay, we have to rewrite this story because then the coal phase out and as well the achievement of the German targets would be probably achieved fully market-driven because the CO2 prices on the EU emissions trading system would be much higher than they are now. They are now 25 euros. We expect them to increase to 30, 35 by 2030. If we ratchet further our CO2 targets, they might be even higher, and then the coal power plants will go out of business anyway. So we have to watch what's happening on the European scale. At the moment, we think that the German ambitions are still stricter than the European ones. As I said, this can be changing. So here you can see what they are actually proposing. I told you with 40 gigawatt, a bit more of coal power plants, and this is the phase-out schedule. This is the reference with 45 years lifetime. Probably this is historical. We think that 45 years is no longer going to hold for the future. So you can see that, well, in these early years, it's more or less very close to what we think would happen anyways on the market. But it really shows that there are some newer power plants, coal power plants, that have been built in the last decade, okay, that would operate in the market way into the 2040s, 2050s. And these 10 gigawatt, they are staying there for a longer time. They are very likely not driven out by these market developments, and they are probably as well something that government has to look into deeper. In order to find ways to convert these power plants in the longer run. So this is the exit timeline. I think it's as well important to see that there's a review going to happen in 2023, 2026 and 2029, exactly on this issue of affordability and supply security. I think that's very important to take that serious because, as I told you, I think especially here in the end of the 2020s, we are really going to face some problems or some issues if we are not really ahead with first our grid build out. So we have a lot to do in extending our transmission grids. and this is going very slow, but we need it for this policy, and we need more renewables. I told you that this is getting more and more difficult, and we have to as well start into thinking about storage options, which at the moment is not really happening in Germany. You can argue that it's not needed, and that's exactly what you can see on the markets. There's no pricing of flexibility, but this is going to come as these capacities are reduced, and then we really have to have the solutions ready. Okay, so I just want to add one sentence on carbon pricing. If the new Commission is going to change these long-term targets, we are going to see that these higher carbon pricing are going to drive out most of the coal endogenously. There is, of course, as well an opportunity that Germany is setting its own carbon prices as a minimum price of the EU emissions trading system, and that is something that I was as well recommending for the coal phase out, because that would be, of course, a much easier way to reduce emissions in the sector by carbon pricing. Government is going to go for a regulated phase out, so they are now starting to negotiate with the different coal power companies for trying to find voluntary solutions with compensation to closed power plants. I think that's probably the third best approach. I would rather like to see this happening via the markets, and the EU ETS actually is well positioned to do that. So that's something, of course, that is as well important in order to incentivize all these different options I talked about. If you don't have proper carbon pricing, you are going to see more or less a shift from one coal plant to the other coal plant, from the old ones to the newer ones, or then to the gas plants, but you don't really incentivize all these flexibility options that are out there. So therefore, I think that is something that has to be kept in mind. I already talked about the impact on electricity costs, stating that, well, electricity is going to be much more expensive in 10 years than today. The coal phase out is adding to this. It's as well, of course, important to note that these higher costs or these higher prices are going to benefit these newer coal power plants. So we are doing some calculation that shows that, of course, it's really the last plant operating that's getting the highest revenue out of this coal phase out, which is also something you have to consider when designing these policies, because they really benefit from higher utilization factors, lower variable cost, because phase out is pushing CO2 prices and higher electricity prices that they are seeing on the wholesale market. Last point I would like to make is on security of supply, because that is something we talked about already a bit, and I mentioned that Germany is going to be a net electricity importer by 2030, and that, of course, can be a political problem. Well, in fact, of course, we have an internal market, so we are, exporting and importing electricity all the time. But in this new future of scarcity in generation, this discussion might, come back again. So it's really a question whether Germany is willing to import 5-10 gigawatt of electricity from the neighbors, or whether this is seen as being too risky, given that they might as well have restrictions in their electricity systems. And so this is something that has to be thought about in the longer term. We have many studies, or we have several studies now looking until 2025, and there it doesn't seem to be a problem. So for the next years we are doing okay, but later on we might need more generation capacity, and that is very likely to be gas-fueled. that might be peakers, gas peakers that help us in hours where we don't have the renewables in place. Of course, that is as well an additional investment that has to be made, but the time span there is probably not that long, so we can act relatively quickly once we see we are running into these problems in order to cover what we now call the Dunkelflaute, the dark lull, these times where we have 2 weeks of no generation from solar and wind, which has actually happened substantially in the future. Gas, of course, has another, it's not only relatively cheap and reliable, but it has as well the possibility to be carbon neutral. So there's a lot of discussion on carbon neutrality now. And potentially, of course, you can run this as well with green hydrogen, methane, and as well move into carbon neutral Germany by 2050. So you see there are a lot of challenges ahead. And I'm not talking now about how we should go along with our renewable policies. I already indicated that this was very costly in the past and continue to be problematic. I already talked about the grid extension as a bottleneck that is really problematic, raised a lot of public resistance now with new power lines. And last year in Germany, we had less than 100 kilometers of new power lines built. We need something like 8,000 kilometers. So you can see that there's a big problem there as well. But as I said, there are as well these reviews that are going to happen in 2023, 2026, and 2029, and we are going to tackle them in our monitoring, extend the measures I showed you and the targets by question of regional employment, structural policies, and as well regional value added, as I already outlined. So we have done that in Germany, and of course you can say, well, that's different here, no? Because we already heard, no? You have all these mining communities, and I just want to show you that in Germany, people are very proud of the coal industry, no? So I mean, when I was at ANU, I spent a day in Parliament, and actually one of the Queensland representatives, he said, well, we are proud of our coal industry, okay? And I said, well, we are as well proud of our coal industry in Germany. And to make this point, I just show you this here. I don't know whether you have seen this. In Europe, that's very big. It's called Panini Collectors Books. So you do that for World Championship, no? So you can collect your favorite players, and you're trading, in schools, to put up your collector albums. And I wanted to show you that, actually we have one for coal phase out. So here it says Schwarzes Gold, black gold. Okay, and this was actually published last year when the last coal mine was stopping production. Okay, so you could, collect this and buy this. Actually, I'm only missing 3 pictures. I collected myself, so you can see, the history of the different mines, the coal barons, and all this. So there's a lot of history to coal mining in Germany, in the Ruhr Valley especially. So this is really something that is in the heart of many people. Nevertheless, they have seen that, that there is simply not really a future on this, and they have embraced the idea of thinking about how to change it in a long-term sustainable manner. And this is the story behind the German energy transition. And indeed, I think we can learn a lot from each other here in Australia with these vast and diverse energy, mineral, land resources that you're having, and as well, the Germans, with their strong service and manufacturing sector and in their experience in the energy transition, I would really appreciate if we start this dialogue, and I'm very happy that we do it today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Andreas. really enlightening, and I just think it highlights, just how much we can learn from our international partners, and many of those challenges. I think here Australia is an island in its own right. The luxury of having grids. We share between states, not between countries, and I think that's quite interesting. To sort of give some light to this, we're actually going to have a panel discussion. So I've got two esteemed colleagues, friends, Professor Andrew Garnett, Director Centre for Coal Seam Gas. Most of you probably know Alf, but just in case, a former Shell and Schlumberger executive, Andrew has over 30 years worldwide experience with oil majors in conventional and unconventional hydrocarbon exploration, appraisal and development. Obviously, he joined UQ in 2012, and he's currently managing the unconventional gas and CCS research programs. He's also an advisor to the International Energy Agency World Energy Outlook on unconventional gas and on carbon capture and storage. And then also Lucy Burke. Lucy's one of our Master of Sustainable Energy students. She is a UQ Energy Leader Scholar. And we thought it would be great to get a young person's view, not that saying they're not young, but a younger person's view. Lucy's actually in her second year of the Masters. She's studying part-time. She's an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering and has been working in the gas industry for 7 years. So I think it's interesting to sort of hear that perspective, and we recognised her potential, giving her the Energy Leader Scholarship, that we really see her as a future leader. So, if you can mic up, and Alf, I might ask you just to give a response, to what you took away from your situation, because I think here in Queensland, it's also even more pertinent to hear what Andreas was able to offer.
Yeah, I think so thank you very much, by the way. That's a fantastic study, and I think what comes out of it immediately, particularly with the recent experience of our election, is that there's a horrible feedback loop coming your way as the prices rise and the social and political landscape changes, which will constrain choices, I think, significantly, and may even do a revert. You can even imagine a revert to cheap, right, or a revert to coal. And I don't think we know how to deal with, in our setting or in any other setting, I don't think we know how to deal in a modelling or a forecasting sense with that sort of feedback loop as prices rise, which you also can imagine it's going to happen, but how the hell you plan and deal with that, I really don't know. So that was the first one. The other thing I think which was interesting, and you just mentioned it a moment ago, so I'm going to drop you in it, is that the whole carbon capture and storage piece has fallen away, right? So it's fallen off the agenda for a large part. So when we saw, what we've seen is a phase out of coal, not the phase out of carbon from coal. So it's immediately been discounted as a feasible option. And to some extent, it seems to have been forgotten here too, other than the study that we've just finished, Peter. So I think there's an awful lot of very interesting parallels. There's the states versus countries parallel. There's a big question you should sort of hinted at, which is what if every other country does the same thing, then where are you going to import your energy from? You're also getting very exposed to gas and your friends to the east, particularly in that 2050 time. So it raises a bunch of risks into the whole energy sector, which is going to play out over time, which I don't think we've got any clue how to deal with. I think I'm just going to leave it.
Okay, yep. Lucy, I might get you to give your response, and then we'll ask Andreas to respond to some of those, and then I'm going to open up to questions.
Sure, thanks Peter, and thanks Andreas for your talk. It was very interesting. I guess my reflections during your talk was, I was thinking of the similarities and the differences between the German situation and the Australian situation. So I think the main one that really jumped out to me is the strong reliance on coal in Germany and on coal-based generation, which we have here in Australia, and especially in Queensland. And I think really one of the main challenges will be that phase out and that move away from coal, and that the impact on the miners and the mining communities, which is a really key issue, especially here in Queensland. So it'll be really interesting to see Germany's plan for addressing the social side of that as well. I think a key difference, my impression was that Germany has a much clearer policy setting and clear commitments and targets, which we're not really seeing here in Australia, which is challenging for investment decisions and for energy companies planning their way forward. So I think there's a lot of things we can learn from each other. I think Australia is quite unique in that we are an island nation, and so we can't rely on those imports and also or take advantage of export. So it's probably a key difference there.
Okay. Well, we're lucky we've got Tasmania. So. Andreas, did you want to kick off with some, thoughts and things?
Well, I think these are all thanks for the comments, and the suggestions. I think they are very valid. You were talking a bit about potential backlash, in terms of policies, and I think that is really something that worries many policymakers in Germany as well. You know that, or I highlighted that there are quite some, in Germany we have about 20,000 people employed in the coal sector at the moment. So for Germany this is not a big number, so it's not really about the magnitude. It's relatively small compared as well to the miners, 600,000 coal miners in the past. So this is relatively small, but they are located, part of them are located in the east of Germany, which has traditionally also other problems economically after reunification. And we see that, we have right-wing parties on the rise in East Germany. We will have elections coming up in September. So politicians are very worried, that whether these energy topics might be topics that, that are boosting, these elections. And I think therefore, we are at the moment in the beginning of understanding that this energy transition will not be priceless. It will cost something. And a lot of the policies that we have seen in Germany so far were policies that gave money to somebody, to achieve something, and that is helpful to some extent. But in the end, I think we are now moving into a new regime where you have to put prices on things that you don't want to happen. And this is just changing the picture. And so we are going to see how the support keeps up when these new policies are going to be implemented indeed. We think it's going to keep up because if you look at different movements we see, we heard about school strikes for future, for example. That's in Germany now really a big thing. So policymakers really pay attention to that. It has really shifted the discussion. You see climate topics. I mean, I'm doing climate policies for 20 plus years. You see this now. I mean, nobody cared, okay, for a long time. You see this now in the newspaper every day. People are talking about it. Tonight I'm going to have a phone call with the German Christian Democratic Party because they are now trying to be on the forefront of this development, putting up a carbon price. Unthinkable, just 5 years ago. So this has really changed substantially. Why? Because of these movements, but also because of election results. We just had a European election. I told you about it. The Green Party got the largest shares with voters under 60. Okay, in Germany. Okay, so that's amazing. So you see that there is a large support for that in all the parties. They see this and they really try to fill this gap. So that's true for the Social Democrats. That's true for the conservative parties because the voters have really shifted their attention to the topic. And I think that's very close to what you said about the social change and the transfer. German government committed 40 billion on transition measures to the east of Germany. Now, if you do the math, I told you there are 20,000 people in the coal industry and they commit 40 billion. So that's a lot of money. Okay, that's 2 million per worker. And most of these workers are relatively old. It's different from Australia, by the way. The German workers are relatively old. Many of them are close to retirement. So we think that with these type of measures, we are going to really take care of many of them. But it's probably more than the money, and that's something that we have to see as well, especially in Eastern Germany. And just a last comment on CCS. Well, CCS will be a big topic in Germany because we know that if we want to become carbon neutral, we need CCS. We probably in Germany. We don't need it in the electricity generation, but for sure we need it in industry. So now we have a big discussion how to do that, and we have a German delegation coming over with people from ThyssenKrupp and others that try to think about green steel making and this type of things, no? And that will be part of the solution space. And so therefore I totally agree that, I mean, Germans have as well stopped working on CCS quite some time ago. I think that's bad, no? Because we know that it's going to be part of the solution. In the IPCC report, we've seen that we need a lot of negative emissions to achieve these targets, and there are different negative emission technologies, but surely it will be as well partly CCS.
I think it's also though, a lower cost pathway to decarbonising the electricity grid. It's a colleague over there, Jeff Bongers, and has just finished some work for us where you can see you can get a certain distance decarbonising with renewables, and after that you sort of get the prices go through the roof. And so in line with the IEA work, if you add CCS to the grid, to gas and coal, then that's a cheaper way to get to low carbon electricity. And again, it seems to be, if you go phase out coal rather than retrofit coal, you lose a low cost pathway potentially.
Yeah, but then again, I mean, you know, again, these policy choices, as I said, I mean, they are driven as well by public perception. And in Germany, we have very strong public perception about some technologies in the energy space. We talked about nuclear. So Germans don't like nuclear. That's not an economic argument. That's just they don't like it. No, and the same is true for CCS. No, I mean, if you go to Germany, you will see that they have basically banned CCS now in all states of Germany, and that is supported by, you know, all the public opinion polls we know. No, so this is really something that I think we have to change, but probably shouldn't overdo it in the German case. No, I mean, if we get this for the industry part, I mean, we would be already happy, because otherwise we are going to face much more expensive solution, or we don't even have one.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I might open it up to the floor because there's a lot of people here that came to hear you speak. Is there anyone that's got a question for anyone here? Yes. If you'd like to introduce yourself and stand up with a big voice, thank you. Oh, if you can bring the mic, that would be great. Thank you. If someone else got a question, if you put your hand up, I might get the second mic to you so it can be quicker. Okay.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Demas. I am Master of Sustainable Energy student, and this is my first year. Okay, from the presentation, mostly you talk about the carbon pricing. This is very interesting for me. I would like to know about your opinion about, is that possible to apply carbon pricing policy in developing countries? Let's say in Indonesia, in my country, mostly we still have subsidized in full price and also the electricity price. And we also have, and in Indonesia we just built many power plants, especially coal-fired power plants with long-term power purchase agreement. I don't know, I think it's very hard in Indonesia to do the energy transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Demas. Andreas, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, well, I think that's the interesting thing about this energy transition is that there is no solution that fits every country, no? And that's actually, I mean, I just wrote a piece on G20 for the G20 German presidency, where we try to think about this energy transition from a regional point of view or for a country-specific point of view, because I mean, all countries know they have different resources, they have different access to technologies, you know, they have different security of supply situations and so forth. So therefore, I think it's really up to each country, you know, to find the mix that fits best. I think in general, of course, it's always a good idea not to subsidize something that is bad, no? So this is a general, I think, lesson that you can take away as well for this case. But of course, carbon pricing is not going to fix everything easily, because there are a lot of other problems, you know, in the markets that are not addressed by carbon pricing. You know, think about our transport sector. If you introduce carbon pricing, you're not going to see big things happening, I guess, no, because the price signal will be relatively small, and there are other obstacles, you know, infrastructure, you know, fueling stations for, you know, electricity for electric cars, for hydrogen cars. We have 60 hydrogen fueling stations in Germany. So there are a lot of other problems to bring in new technologies. They are not going to be all driven by prices, but we think that a proper pricing system is helpful, and then you can adjust it with all these other measures that are necessary. And in terms of the distributional side, I think actually the distribution part is not very unfavorable in the carbon pricing debate, because at least for the German case, all these studies indicate that if you refund the money from the carbon pricing, I mean that's the condition, if you refund it on a per capita basis, for example, or via cutting all the other electricity related costs in Germany, you're actually favoring relatively low income families. So if it's done properly, it is not necessarily a problem as well in terms of distributional impacts, but of course it has to be done properly.
Okay.
There's just one small addition
Very quick,
to that.
and then I
is
might
that
ask Lucy her thoughts about
You've just got a very
developing country.
different, it's a little bit of an unfair comparison. You're going through a transition, but it's a different transition. You're transitioning to access, right? We've done that already here. So it's a little bit, I would suggest, unfair to suggest that your transition is to low carbon before it's transitioning to access. So
It's a challenge for the world, isn't it, at the moment? Lucy, did you have any thoughts from a developing country, your thoughts or price and,
I guess it kind of comes back to the global question of who does the heavy lifting and who's responsible for what percentage of carbon reduction emissions, and the question of the developing world versus the developed world's responsibility. So I think, Indonesia's at a very, very different point to where Germany or Australia would be. I think maybe in the Germany-Australia situation, a carbon price might be the best way to implement a market force or market driver on that. But Indonesia's probably a different point.
It's one of the things we grapple with, those 1 billion people. Thank you, Damas. There's a question up here. Thank you.
Hi, Bruce Patrick. I guess listening to the presentation, I got the feeling that, in fact, the problems aren't greatly different between Germany and Australia. Same old problem. How do you actually get fundamental dispatchable electricity supply guaranteed, which really goes to how you maintain all your industry? And I guess one of the questions then is, what is that level of dispatchable percentage of the overall supply you do need to keep in place in a practical sense anyway? And also, not much discussion there about new technologies outside of everything else we've talked about that may come into the future. And storage is another one you didn't talk about, and I understand there's been some dam storage and so forth in Germany, and a question of whether that's actually working or not.
Yeah, I said timeline-wise, these are things that really have to be in place, let's say, in a decade from now. And so therefore, we are seeing a lot of research around, for example, what we call power to X, so green liquids, green methane, hydrogen in Germany, and that is something that we think will play a really important role in 10 plus years to come. And actually the delegation I was talking about, the German delegation, they will have a focus on hydrogen because we believe a bit on the story of shipping the sun, the Australian story, becoming an energy superpower. And we would like to explore what that could entail, because in the end, as you have already highlighted, we are going to be an energy importer in the future. And we have to see how we can actually sustain our energy supply. And that will be, of course, as well an issue for geopolitical concerns. You talked about Russia, which is a really big part now, and we think that Australia can be a really important part of the story too. And in terms of storage, I mean, we are going to see, I think, a lot of developments as well on the technology side. And we try to push that as well from the German industrial perspective, it might be that this is probably happening more in China and in other places in Asia than it's in Germany. The Germans have actually brought down the PV costs substantially. We might not be the ones buying down the storage costs, but we try. Actually, my university just got a big grant for industrial battery producer in Germany. So we try to do that. But this is something we don't need today. We need it in a decade or so.
Any other comments? No? Has anyone else got a question here? Yeah, over here in the corner. I think it's interesting, this whole transition and how we manage it. One of the things that comes to mind is you mentioned the wind and the coexistence, and I think we're seeing a lot of these things play out around where do we position these projects, and the discussion of hydrogen and so forth. Is that going to be in places where it will actually help communities transition, or does it have to be near the ports, which therefore then creates its own challenges, I suppose? So, yeah, thank you. Irene.
Hi, my name's Irene Tetici.
Can you hold the mic up? Sorry.
I'm just interested in the forecasting of electricity demand over the period of the transition, that other technologies are moving to use more electricity if we move from oil-based to using electricity, and what impact, what sort of forecasting are you making over the transition period for electricity demand as our society uses more electricity, and how will that impact, how do you see that impacting what you've presented today?
So I think that's of course that's a really important part of what I showed you in terms of these scenarios for 2030 and ahead. Now, how much will electricity demand actually be? And I think there are two developments. The first is, of course, we try to become more efficient on the demand side, and that we are seeing already in Germany, even though it's not as fast as we expect it to be, but it's reducing electricity consumption. On the other hand, there are, of course, newer applications, electricity applications, and we think that we are going to see an electrification of the energy system much more than we thought a decade ago. And in Germany, there are two main technologies. The first one is heat pumps in the building sector. The other one is electric vehicles in the transport sector. And so therefore, when I talked about CO2 price reforms, I made a proposal to use the receipts from CO2 pricing in order to reduce the additional costs on electricity to make renewable electricity cheap. Because in Germany, you have to keep in mind that around 80% of the electricity price comes from non-market-based influences, from taxes, from the feed-in tariffs, from the grid pricing. That's all put on the electricity prices. The wholesale price in Germany is around 5 cents. We have seen that the auctions for renewables and for PV and wind were around 5 to 6 cents in a recent year, but the wholesale electricity price is very different from the consumer price. In Germany, it's 30 cents. Okay, so it's really expensive, and you can imagine that all electricity-related applications are not economic with these very high electricity prices. So what I think you have to do in order to use this electrification, because we have seen that putting renewables in the electricity system is probably much easier than doing emission reduction in the other sectors. So to use the electrification for emission reduction, you have to work on the electricity prices, make them more cheap in order to be picked up in the other sectors. And that's what we call sector coupling. And the sector coupling is going to play a big role in the German energy transition. And you ask about the perspective of electricity demand. Most of these scenarios, they actually think that electricity demand is going to stay relatively flat, or might even increase slightly because of this electrification of the German energy system.
It's all we've really got time for. I might give you 30 seconds to think about a closing comment about what you see as the challenge. I think what's really interesting for me is that around the world, we're in a transition and we're all moving at different pace, at different states, and there's a whole equity issue that emerges here that is really interesting. And I think about the geopolitics. I'm looking at Karen over there. You know, I remember that going to Denmark recently, or a while ago now, but you know, the issue of Russia in the 70s and the gas crisis, everyone was so concerned about importing. You know, that was just a no-no. We all had to become self-sufficient, and yet here we are now in a different world. And so, it's really quite challenging as to where we're going to end up, I think. And so it's been really helpful from my perspective to have someone like Andreas share his views. Lucy, from your perspective, 30 seconds, what do you think is that, you know, challenge?
I mean, I think it always comes back to, for me, the energy trilemma, balancing energy security, affordability and sustainability, and it's really a common challenge across all countries. Even there are slight differences, but really it sort of comes down to how much are we willing to invest and how quickly. You know, the technology is out there, but it's about, I guess, that education and getting the, you know, the social awareness to set the right policy and then make the right investments to head in the right direction. So I think, yeah, there's a lot to learn from Germany, and I'm sure they can learn a lot from us as well.
Alf?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on those last comments, actually, which so it springs to mind if you just think about where our economies, or OECD economies are heading. We're heading into an extremely high-risk future. We're coupling parts of the economy from an energy point of view which weren't coupled before, making much more, so we're de-diversifying the electricity supply, so we're taking out coal and nuclear, we'll leave just solar and gas and wind, or just renewables and wind and gas. So you've immediately increased the risk of supply significantly, being dependent on other people's gas in particular to keep things going. You're then going to put the transport sector of the economy, which is currently not coupled into electricity, going to couple that into this higher risk sector. So the entire economic risk to keep things going is in a world we've not been in before. So I think there is a good question about how much we're willing to play. I'm not sure how we even can figure out how much we can afford to pay in that higher risk, highly coupled future, particularly with the geopolitical risk, but not just the geopolitical, there are real resource risks in there too. So I think getting a hand on that risk-cost balance is still what we're trying to do, I think.
Andreas, the last words.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good comment, because of course, I mean, we should not see this unidimensional in the end, and that's what you both highlighted, and I think that's really important as well to bring into the German debate. So that's as well why we are an energy commission and not a climate commission or whatever, because the energy topics are just more diverse, and they need more consideration on all these different aspects that we have heard, and therefore I think it's good, to bring in this different perspective and as well to the German discussions, and so therefore I think if we get this cooperation with Australia going, I think we can do exactly this. We are currently having this German-Australian energy transition hub, which can work as a vehicle for that. I think that would be very good, and I think we should have more of these discussions, geopolitical discussions, energy resources discussions, and technology discussions as well, showing that we cannot be too narrow-minded as well on our technology sphere, and outside knowledge as well for Germans would be good.
Perfect. I'm very aware of the time. Please join in thanking Andreas, who's interrupted his holiday. And thank you everybody for coming. We couldn't do it without you. That concludes our session, and on your merry way for the next meeting, I'm sure. Thank you.